This is the first lecture of the skeleton. This is the axial skeleton. Just as the axis of the earth runs down the center of the earth, the axial skeleton are the bones that run down the center of the body. The axial skeleton forms the central supporting axis of the body. It consists of the skull, the vertebral column, the sternum, the ribs, the sacrum, and the hyoid bone. For comparison's sake, the appendicular skeleton, as you recall, refers to the part of the skeleton in the extremities, the upper and lower extremity. This consists of the pectoral girdle, the bones of the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and the bones of the lower limbs. We'll start out by discussing the skull. The skull is the most complicated part of the skeleton. The skull is not a single bone, but it's actually 22 bones joined together to form the skull. The skull is divided into two portions. There's a cranial portion and a facial portion. The cranial portion is this area here. It consists of 8 bones that protect and encase the brain. What makes a bone a cranial bone is it has to come in contact with the brain. So these are bones that somehow touch the inside surface of the brain, and they form a protective shell around the brain. There's 8 different bones that form the cranial bones, and the facial bones form the face. So these form the framework of the face. There's 14 bones that form the facial bones. The cranial cavity you see here, this is the brain, and we haven't discussed the brain yet, but this is the cerebrum of the brain, this is the cerebellum of the brain, and these soft tissue parts of the brain are filling up these areas, these fossa of the cranial cavity. Fossa, as you recall from the last lecture, are depressions that are in bone to accommodate soft tissue. So there's a anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. Anterior accommodates this part of the cerebrum. The middle fossa accommodates this temporal lobe of the cerebrum, and the posterior fossa is to give the cerebellum room. If you look from a different viewpoint, looking from above, look at as if the top of the skull was removed, looking at the anterior fossa, the middle fossa, posterior fossa. Remember the Wolff's Law says that the shape of the bone is determined by the forces applied to the bone. So this is as the brain develops, the force of the brain over the newly developing bone creates these fossa, these cavities in the bone that allow for the soft tissue of the brain to develop. So we'll look at the individual cranial bones first. We'll start with the frontal bone. The frontal bone it makes the forehead, it's the front of the skull. It's called the frontal bone. And a few features that I will mention. There's a supraorbital margin. Just think about the word supraorbital. Supra means above, orbital has to do with the eye socket. So it's the margin above the eye socket. Here's the eye socket. It's a ridge that runs right across the upper part of the eye socket. That's a supraorbital margin. And likewise, supraorbital foramen. A foramen is a hole in the supraorbital above the orbit. It's a supraorbital foramen right here. The next bone we discuss is the parietal bone. The parietal bone forms the walls of the sides of the skull. Where parietal means wall, and the inside of the skull looks as if the walls of the skull would be these parietal bones. So there's one on the left and one on the right. There's bilateral parietal bones. Next bone we'll look at is the temporal bone. It's here, and this is the area of the temple. The ear would be here. So this is the area above the ear, so it would be the temple. Therefore, the temporal bone. There's right and left temporal bone. This is a temporal bone as if it was separated from the rest of the skull. And there's several features of the temporal bone, processes and depressions that you need to be familiar with. There's the external acoustic meatus, It's the hole here. This is the hole that allows sound to come into the eardrum. There's the mastoid process. You can feel the mastoid process behind your ear. It's a bony prominence. This is where the attachment of the muscle, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, attaches. There's a styloid process, which is a narrow, needle-like styloid process that sticks out anteriorly and inferiorly. There's a zygomatic process, which is this area here that reaches out and interacts with the zygomatic bone, which forms the cheekbone. You see in the picture here, this all kind of forms an arch. There's a zygomatic process. It connects to the zygomatic bone. And there's the mandibular fossa, where the mandible, or the lower jaw, articulates with the temporal bone. This is the side of the TMJ joint, temporal mandibular joint. Temporal means temporal bone, mandibular is mandible. So the temporal mandibular joint is where the temporal bone and the mandible bone articulate or form a joint. Occipital bone is next. Occipital bone, you recall from the second lecture, the occipital area is the back of the skull. Occipital bone is here in the back of the skull. It's labeled, it's colored brown on the slide. Two prominences that are important for the occipital bone. The first is the foramen magnum. Foramen means hole, magnum means big, so this literally means big hole. This is the opening in the base of the skull where the spinal cord exits the brain cavity. This connects the spinal cord to the brain through this foramen magnum. And there's occipital condyle. A condyle means a joint or an articulation. So this is a smooth portion of the occipital bone that interacts or articulates with the C1 or the top cervical vertebra. So this allows for motion between the cervical vertebra and the occipital bone to this occipital condyle. There's one on the right and left. The sphenoid bone is the somewhat hard to see unless the slide of color. It's represented by this pink bone here. If you take the sphenoid bone separate away from the rest of the skull, it looks like a bat, kind of a bat bone. And it makes it's sort of the capstone of the skull. It basically it touches all the other cranial bones. They all have some sort of contact with the sphenoid bone. So it touches each of the other cranial bones. The final cranial bone is the ethmoid bone. This is the deepest skull bone. It forms part of the nasal septum, and it's right. You see here from the front view. It's this nasal septum area. It's a cranial bone, even though it has a lot of facial features, but it's a cranial bone because it actually touches the cranium. There's a feature called the crista galli. This portion that sticks upward superiorly, and this cribriform plate, which is here. And this, let's see if I have another slide. Well, I don't have another slide to show you. In the lab, you'll be able to see this more clearly. The lab, you'll be able to see the ethmoid bone and distinguish that between the other bones. But it forms, all these form the cranial bones that articulate and touch the brain and protect the brain. Now we're going to turn to the facial bones. These are the bones that construct the basic shape of the face. First we have the zygomatic bone. This forms the cheekbone. The maxilla is the upper jaw. It's where the upper teeth are mounted. It's the area between the nose and the upper teeth. There's a alveolar processes. It's where the teeth are located. And there's an infraorbital foramen here. Just like there's supraorbital foramen in the frontal bone, There's infraorbital foramen in the maxilla. These features are listed here. The mandible is the jawbone. This is the largest and strongest bone of the face. It's also the only bone of the skull that's movable. It connects to the temporal bone by the way of the temporomandibular joint. We discussed that a few minutes ago. This is the temporal bone here, in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, where the mandibular condyle articulates. Remember, a condyle has to do with a joint. It's a smooth surface that composes a joint. We saw that a while ago when we talked about the occipital condyle. Here now we have the mandibular condyle. This is a smooth joint of the mandible that articulates in the temporal mandibular joint, TMJ joint. This is the mandibular notch. This is a carved out area, curved area here. This is the coronoid process. You have here, there's one on the right and one on the left side. You have the ramus of the mandible, which is this upward, up and down portion of the jaw. You have the body of the mandible, which is the horizontal portion of the jaw, and the mandibular angle here. There's a mental foramen, which is in the middle. It means chin. And the lower jaw has alveolar process where the teeth are embedded as well. Just need to be familiar with these different parts of the mandibular bone. The vomer bone is one of the bones. It's a small bone in the nasal cavity area. And this is really hard to see because it's so small, but it's located in the nasal septal area. Vomer bone. The palatine bone forms part of the upper palate, and it's a small bone, but it's part of the facial bone. In the lab, you'll see some of these bones, but even some of these facial bones are hard to see even in the lab. What you will be expected to know is which of these bones are facial bones, which are cranial bones. I may give you a list of bones, and you'll need to know whether they're cranial bones or facial bones. Here's the lacrimal bone. This is a small bone in the inner portion of the orbit. Lacrimal is tear duct. This is the bone that has a opening through it where the tear duct runs through this bone. The nasal bone. So there's a bridge. It's at the bridge of the nose. The inferior nasal concha is part of the inner portion of the nasal cavity. It's represented by this green shaped bone. Again, these are all small bones that are hard to localize, hard to really identify and separate. Now there's joints in the skull where the cranial bones come together. These are called sutures. There's 4 different sutures. There's the coronal suture, which is across the front. The coronal suture separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. It's called coronal because it's like where the crown, when Queen Elizabeth wears her crown, it's kind of sits over this part of her skull. It's the coronal bone. Think of crown, separating the frontal bone from the parietal bone. The sagittal suture. Remember the sagittal plane when we discussed that on the second lecture. Sagittal plane separates the body into left and right halves, and the mid-sagittal line separates evenly mid-sagittal. That's the sagittal suture is somewhat in the sagittal plane, and it separates the left and right parietal bone. The lambdoid suture is here. It's kind of a Y-shaped suture. This is named after the Greek letter lambda, which has a similar appearance to the letter Y. And it separates the parietal bones from the occipital bones. The 4th suture is the squamous suture, and that's better seen on the side. Here's the squamous suture. It separates the parietal bone from the temporal bone. So you need to be familiar with the 4 different sutures of the cranial bones. Now moving out of the skull, coming to the next bone down is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is unique among all the other bones because it does not articulate with any other bone. It's a loner. It does not articulate with any other bone. It's attached through muscles and through tendons and ligaments, but not through a bony connection or through a joint to another bone. This is where muscles for swallowing and speech are attached. Below that, we'll come to the vertebral column. The purpose of the vertebral column is to transmit the weight of the trunk to the lower limbs to surround and protect the spinal cord. And there's 5 sections of the vertebral column. There's the cervical vertebra. There's 7 cervical vertebra. There's 12 thoracic vertebra. There's 5 lumbar vertebra. The sacrum is actually 5 bones initially that fuse and become one functional bone. The coccyx is 3 to 4 bones initially that fuse to form one functional bone, or the tailbone. Remember, there's 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. You can remember this by the fact that you eat breakfast at 7, have lunch at 12, and have supper at 5. This is a silly way to remember it, but it helps. Sometimes the sillier the better. It helps you remember the numbers. The normal spinal column, or vertebral column, has different curves. There's cervical curve, how this curves, and there's a thoracic curve, and there's a lumbar curve, and a sacral curve. If you're standing in the back, looking towards the spine, if you're standing here looking in this direction, the cervical spine is going to be concave towards posterior. So in other words, it's hollowed out. It's just concavity. If you're back here facing towards the back of the spine, the thoracic spine is convex. It means it's angled towards you. The lumbar spine is concave. It's angled away from you. Sacral spine is convex. So it kind of makes an S-shaped curve. That's in the lateral view, but notice that in the AP view, front to back, it should be straight in the normal circumstances. It should be straight. This just shows the same information, showing the cervical curvature, the thoracic curvature, the lumbar curvature, the sacral curvature. The thoracic bones are numbered: C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and then after that comes T1 for first thoracic, all the way to T12. Follow that by L1 for the lumbar 1, all the way to lumbar 5. And the sacrum is just considered one bone because all these are fused, so it acts as if it's one bone, and the coccyx is acts as if it's one bone as well. If you have normal curves to the spine, first of all, if you look at if I go back to this picture here, how looking at the spine from the front or the back, how normally it's straight. If that is curved in the AP view, anterior posterior view, that's what gives an abnormal curvature called scoliosis. See how scoliosis, how instead of it being straight, there's an S-shaped curve looking from the anterior posterior view. Now, there's also some abnormal curvatures in the lateral view of the spine. There's kyphosis, which is exaggerated thoracic curvature. Normally, the thoracic has a curvature that's convex towards the posterior, and the kyphosis is exaggerated, kind of giving a hunchback appearance. And lordosis is when you have an exaggerated lumbar curvature. See this, like in someone who's pregnant, the center of gravity is more in front than normal, so the body compensates by leaning backwards to try to get center of gravity over the hips and the lower extremities. We'll look at the general structure of just your basic general vertebra. There's several features that are common to most all vertebrae. First of all, there's the body of the vertebra. This is the weight-bearing portion of the vertebra. Just about all the vertebra from C2 down have a body. In the center, there's a vertebral foramen. This is where the spinal cord goes through. This is in all the vertebral bodies. It goes all the way from the C1 down to the lumbar. That's where the spinal cord runs up and down the vertebral column. There's this spinous process that sticks out posteriorly towards the back, and there's transverse processes that stick out to the side. Connecting the transverse process to the spinous process is the lamina, and then connecting the transverse process to the body is the pedicle. So this is the pedicle here, this is the lamina here, transverse process, spinous process, transverse process, body. This is a facet joint, which is a joint between one vertebra and the vertebra above and below it. Out here really just describe the same thing. The vertebral foramen here in the center, intervertebral foramina are the openings between the vertebra where the spinal nerves exit. I think I may have a slide to show you that. Let me show you that. Let me go up a few slides. This is the intervertebral foramen here. There's a hole between each of the foramen. Intervertebral, think of interstate, it means between the states. Intervertebral means between the vertebra. So the hole, foramina, it means hole. It's a hole in between the vertebra. That's where the spinal nerves exit the spinal vertebral canal to go down to the limbs or supply the muscles of the arms and legs. There's an intervertebral foramen all the way up and down the spine at each level. So that's the lateral opening between adjacent vertebra for spinal nerves to exit. We've kind of mentioned this already. The processes, there's a spinous process that sticks posterior, there's a transverse process laterally, there's a superior articular process and inferior articular process. These are these facet joints. There's one that sticks up superior that interacts with the vertebral body above this location, and there's one on the other side that interacts with the vertebral body that's below. This will make more sense in the lab when you see these three-dimensionally. Start with the cervical vertebra. There's C1 through C7. These are the smallest and the lightest of the vertebra. In the cervicals, there's two things that are unique about the cervical vertebra. The spinous processes are bifid, or forked, except for C7. And the transverse process has a foramen in the transverse process. That's only seen in the cervical vertebra. So one part of the lab exam is you have to identify a vertebra and you have to determine whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar. Well, what you do, if it's cervical, you're going to see a bifid spinous process and you'll see a transverse foramen in the transverse process. Let me show you a picture of that. Here's a cervical. Here's the body of cervical. Here's a transverse process here, and see how there's an opening, a transverse foramen opening. It's called transverse foramen because it's the foramen in the transverse process. This is the transverse process. It's the foramen in the transverse process. That's why it's called a transverse foramen. The spinous process is bifid or forked. That's only seen in the cervical. So if you see a vertebral body that has a forked spinous process, it's cervical. No question, it's cervical. If you see a vertebral body that has a hole in the transverse process, it's cervical. End of discussion. That's only seen in the cervical spine, not in the thoracic, not in the lumbar. So that's what you look for to know if you're in the cervical. There's two unique vertebrae in the cervical spine, the C1 and C2. There's commonly called C1 is commonly called the atlas, C2 is called the axis. I wonder why it has such an interesting name. Do you remember in Greek mythology, Atlas was the strong man who held the world on his shoulders? The C1 is analogous to Atlas, who carries the world on his shoulder. The C1 carries the skull on his shoulder. So it's called the Atlas. It has an articular process on C1 that articulates with the occipital condyle that we talked about when we talked about the occipital bone. And that articulation allows you to shake your head up and down as if you're saying yes, nodding your head up and down. The nodding up and down takes place between the C1 vertebral body and the occipital bone. That's the atlas. C1 is atlas. C2 is the axis. It's called axis because it has a process that sticks upward, and then C1 rotates around this process. So it rotates around. This allows you to shake your head side to side as if you're saying no, shaking your head no. So the shake your head yes is between the occipital bone and C1. Turn your head saying no is between C1 and C2. This is another view of C2 looking from above, looking down on the, this would be the dens, which sticks out from the slide. It's kind of hard to see because it's three-dimensional process here, which sticks out. Question for you. Which animal has the most cervical vertebrae, a giraffe or rat? It's kind of a trick question because both giraffe and rat have 7 cervical vertebrae. All mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. The giraffe just has bigger cervical vertebrae than the rat. And again, human, we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Let's move now to the thoracic vertebra. That's T1 through T12. They have a long spinous process that points inferiorly. And that's the distinguishing feature of the thoracic vertebra. Let me show you a picture of it. Here's the lateral view of the thoracic vertebra, how it has a spinous process that sticks outward, down, and goes downward. It's kind of slender. Notice there's no transverse foramen here, and there's no bifid spinous process. So this is not cervical because there's no bifid spinous process, no transverse foramen. But it does have this inward, inferiorly directed spinous process. And looking at an angle, this looks like a giraffe's head. I guess giraffes are common with the spine, but this looks like a giraffe's head. Next comes the lumbar vertebra, L1 through L5. This receives the most stress, so therefore these bones are going to be the sturdiest, the bulkiest, and the largest of the vertebrae because they have to hold the stress of all the weight of the vertebrae above and the body above. Again, the Wolff's Law says that the shape of the bones is a result of the pressure on it. Lumbar vertebrae are under more pressure and stress than the others, so therefore the bones have to be thicker and more substantial. The spinous process in the lumbar vertebra is a flat, hatchet-shaped process, and the lumbar vertebra is just a larger vertebra than the others. Let's see a picture of that. You see it has more squared off, boxy body. Spinous process laterally looks like it looks large. It looks like it's wide, but looking from above, it's very thin in this angle. So it's kind of a thin, but take us a space anterior to posteriorly. Again, there's no transverse foramen here, and there's no bifid process here, so it's not cervical. It doesn't look like a giraffe's head. The spinous process is not point downward, so it's not thoracic. It's lumbar. Shows the lumbar vertebra. I put this picture just to illustrate that this represents the spinal column, vertebral column. How starting with this is the head, and each layer that you go down lower gets larger than the layer above. That's the way the vertebral bodies are. Each layer as you go down towards the lumbar gets larger to accommodate the weight of the body above that. Now between the disc, between the vertebra of the spine from the cervical all the way to the lumbar, there's a disc, intervertebral disc. When you hear about somebody herniating disc or having a slip disc, this is what's happening. There's a disc that acts as a joint between these vertebral bodies. The disc is composed of 2 portions. There's an inner gelatinous nucleus called the nucleus pulposus. It gives elasticity and flexibility to the disc. And the nucleus pulposus is surrounded by annulus fibrosus, an outer collar composed of collagen fibrocartilage. Remember, fibrocartilage is the type of cartilage that's designed to bear weight, and then we talked about it being found in the disc of the vertebral column. This is now the disc of the vertebral column. To me, it's analogous to a jelly donut. The intervertebral disc is like a jelly donut. The jelly would be the nucleus pulposus, and the bread represents annulus fibrosus. So when a disc is herniated, it's like the jelly comes out of the jelly donut, and the disc is herniated. Here's a cartoon of the herniated disc, showing the herniated portion out here. You can press upon the nerve. This is different spinal cord and nerve from spinal cord. That's why a herniated disc can be very painful, because it comes in close contact to the nerve. It goes down into the leg or the arm. Here's an MRI, lateral view, looking at the herniated disc from a side-to-side view, showing the disc that's herniated out into the spinal canal. Moving on down to the sacrum. The sacrum is 5 vertebrae that are fused to form one functional bone. This sacrum articulates with the ilium, forming the sacroiliac joint. Ilium is one of the bones of the pelvis. We'll discuss the ilium later in the appendicular skeleton, actually. And then the coccyx is 3 to 5 vertebrae that's fused to form one functional bone. This is commonly called the tailbone. Here is a picture of both the sacrum and the coccyx together. Now, to finish out the axial skeleton, we need to look at the thoracic cage. Basically, the thoracic cage are the ribs. Function of the ribs are to protect the vital organs of the thoracic cavity, support the shoulder girdle and the upper limbs, and provide attachment site for muscles. What makes up the thoracic cage? Well, first of all, there's the sternum or the breastbone. The sternum has 3 portions. There's the manubrium, the upper portion, the body, the middle portion, and the xiphoid process. Those 3 components make up the sternum. Here's a picture of the sternum in relationship to the ribs. There's 12 pairs of ribs. There's 1 pair of ribs for each thoracic vertebra. There's 12 thoracic vertebrae. There's 12 pairs of ribs. The first 7 are true ribs. The first 7 are true ribs, and they're called true ribs because they have their own cartilage that connects the rib to the sternum. See, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They all have their own cartilage connected to the sternum. Below that are the false ribs, 8 through 12. 8. And these are false ribs because they don't have a unique connection to the sternum. They piggyback onto the cartilage above. So this piggybacks up to the cartilage above here. This piggybacks up to the cartilage above here. This piggybacks up here. So they hitch a ride with the cartilage on the rib above them. So they're called false ribs for that reason. And then the last 2 ribs, 11 and 12, are called floating ribs because they don't have any cartilaginous attachment to the sternum at all. And they're not literally floating. There's muscles and ligaments that hold those ribs in place, but they're not attached to the sternum. That's the thing to remember. They're not attached to the sternum, so that's why they're called floating ribs. Here's a close-up of the rib. There's a curve in the rib or angle of the rib. The rib has a shaft. This is another picture of a rib from a different angle. And that's the axial skeleton.